The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in April 1944, but Margaret Chen wouldn't open it until 3 years later. She kept it in a wooden box beneath her bed in San Francisco, where dust gathered on promises that were never meant to be broken. Inside that envelope, written in James Sullivan's careful handwriting, were the words, "I'll find you when this is over. Wait for me under the cherry trees where we first met. I promise." But James never came home from the beaches of Normandy, and Margaret never stopped waiting. Their story began in the spring of 1941, before Pearl Harbor turned the world upside down, before young men became soldiers and goodbyes became forever. Margaret was 22 years old, studying to become a nurse at the University of California, her black hair always pinned back neatly, her eyes bright with determination. She had immigrated from Shanghai with her family when she was 10, and she carried her mother's jade bracelet on her wrist wherever she went, a reminder of home, of roots, of belonging to two worlds at once. James Sullivan was 24, an Irish-American literature student with dreams of becoming a writer. He had sandy brown hair that never quite stayed in place, green eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul, and a smile that made you believe everything would turn out all right. His father worked at the docks, and James had grown up with salt air in his lungs and stories in his heart. He wanted to write the great American novel. Instead, he would write letters from a war that would swallow him whole. They met by accident on a Thursday afternoon in Golden Gate Park. Margaret had been studying beneath the cherry blossom trees near Stowe Lake, her medical textbooks spread around her like fallen petals. James had been walking, trying to clear his head after a difficult exam, when a sudden gust of wind sent Margaret's papers flying through the air like white birds. He chased them down for her, running and laughing, and when he handed them back, their fingers touched, and something shifted in the universe. Something small and profound and irreversible. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I would have lost an entire week's worth of notes." "Then I'm glad the wind was feeling mischievous today," he replied, and his smile made her heart do something it had never done before. It stumbled, caught itself, and beat faster. They started meeting under those cherry trees every Thursday afternoon. At first they just talked, about books and dreams and the way the light fell through the branches. James told her about growing up in the Sunset District, about his mother who died when he was 12, about the stories his Irish grandmother used to tell him about selkies and changelings and love that transcended death itself. Margaret told him about Shanghai, about the smell of jasmine in her grandmother's garden, about leaving everything behind and learning to call a new place home. "Do you ever feel like you're standing between two worlds?" she asked him once as pink petals drifted down around them like snow. "Every day," he said quietly. "I think that's what makes us who we are, all the places we carry inside us." By summer, they were in love. By autumn, they were talking about the future, a small house near the ocean, children who would grow up with stories and cherry blossoms and the freedom to be themselves. James wanted to write. Margaret wanted to heal. Together, they wanted to build a life that mattered, but the world had other plans. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor, and everything changed overnight. Suddenly, Margaret's Chinese heritage was questioned, suspected, examined. People who had smiled at her the day before now looked at her differently, the university whispered. Strangers stared, and James held her hand tighter, refusing to let go even when his friends suggested he should. "I don't care what they think," he told her fiercely, standing outside her family's apartment in Chinatown. "I love you, Margaret. That's not going to change because the world has gone crazy." "It's not that simple anymore," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Your father already told you to stay away from me. People are scared. They're angry." "Then let them be angry," he said, taking her face in his hands. "I'm not going anywhere," but he was. They both knew it. Young men all over America were enlisting, driven by patriotism and fury, and the bone-deep need to do something, to fight back, to make sense of a world that no longer made sense. James enlisted in the army in January 1942, and Margaret felt her heart break into pieces she wasn't sure she could ever put back together. Their last night together was in March 1942, before he shipped out for basic training. They walked through Golden Gate Park one final time, past Stowe Lake, past the places where they had discovered each other, until they reached their cherry trees. The blossoms hadn't bloomed yet. It was too early in the season, but they stood there anyway, holding on to each other like they could stop time through sheer force of will. "Promise me something," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "Promise me you'll wait for me. I know it's selfish to ask." "It's not selfish," Margaret interrupted. pressing her forehead against his. "I promise. I'll wait for you, James Sullivan. I'll wait right here under these trees. And when you come home, we'll start our life together." "When I come home," he repeated, like it was a prayer, like saying it could make it true. "I'll write to you every chance I get. And when this war is over, I'm going to marry you under these cherry blossoms. And we're going to have that life we talked about. I promise you, Margaret. I promise." They kissed under the bare branches, tasting salt and sorrow and desperate hope. And when he finally pulled away, when he had to leave, when the moment of goodbye became real and unavoidable, Margaret pressed something into his hand, her mother's jade bracelet, the one she never took off. "Bring it back to me," she whispered. "It will keep you safe." He held it like it was made of prayer and glass. "I'll bring it back," he said. "I swear it." She watched him walk away, watched him disappear into the fog that rolled in from the ocean, watched until there was nothing left to see but the empty path and the bare trees, and the future that was supposed to be theirs, slipping away like water through her fingers. The letters started arriving in April 1942, postmarked from places Margaret had to look up on maps. Fort Benning, Georgia. Camp Shanks, New York. Somewhere in England that James couldn't name because of military censorship. Each envelope felt like a lifeline, like proof that he was still alive, still thinking of her, still holding on to the promises they had made under the cherry blossoms. "My dearest Margaret," the first letter began, and she could hear his voice in every word. "I'm writing this from my bunk in the barracks. It's late, and the other guys are asleep, but I can't stop thinking about you. About the way you laughed when the wind stole your papers. About the sound of your voice when you told me about Shanghai. About the feel of your hand in mine. I'm keeping your bracelet in my pocket, right next to my heart. It reminds me of what I'm fighting for. Not just freedom or country, but the chance to come home to you. I love you more than words can say. Wait for me. I'm coming back." Margaret read that letter so many times the paper became soft and fragile. She kept them all in a wooden box her father had made, reading them at night when the loneliness became unbearable, when the waiting felt like it would consume her from the inside out. She wrote back faithfully, filling pages with stories about her work at the hospital. She had graduated early and was now a nurse at San Francisco General, about the cherry blossoms that had bloomed without them, about the future they would build together. By the summer of 1943, James was in England, training for something he couldn't tell her about. His letters became shorter, more careful, but she could read between the lines. He was scared. They all were. Young men playing at being soldiers, trying to be brave when death was waiting across the channel in France. "I met a guy from Boston named Tommy O'Brien," one letter said. "He's 19, barely old enough to shave, and he carries a picture of his sweetheart, a girl named Annie with red hair and freckles. We talk about what we're going to do when we get home. Tommy wants to open a bakery. Can you believe that? A big Irish kid who dreams about bread instead of glory. I told him about you, about our cherry trees, about the life we're going to have. It helps somehow to say it out loud. It makes it feel more real. I'm going to come home to you, Margaret. I swear it on everything I hold sacred." Margaret saved every letter, every word, every promise. But as 1943 turned into 1944, as the war dragged on and the casualty lists grew longer, she started to feel the weight of all that waiting. Her hands trembled when she opened the mailbox. Her heart stopped every time she saw a Western Union boy walking down the street, terrified he would turn toward her building, terrified of the telegram that began with, "We regret to inform you." She threw herself into her work at the hospital, caring for wounded soldiers who came back from the Pacific Theater with shattered bodies and haunted eyes. She held their hands when they cried for their mothers. She changed their bandages and administered their morphine, and listened to their stories about friends who didn't make it home. And every time she thought of James, prayed for James, begged God or fate or whoever was listening to bring him back to her. In May 1944, his letters stopped coming. At first, she told herself it was just the mail, just the chaos of war, just temporary. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into a month, and the silence felt like drowning. She wrote to him anyway, filling pages with hope and fear and the desperate need to believe he was still alive, still thinking of her, still holding on to the promises. "My darling James," she wrote one night in June, tears blotting the ink. "I don't know if you're receiving my letters. I don't know where you are or if you're safe. But I'm still here, still waiting, still believing in us. The cherry trees bloomed again this spring, and I stood under them alone, remembering the promises we made. I'm keeping my promise, James. I'm waiting for you. Please come back to me, please." She never knew if he received that letter. She never knew if he read it in the moments before everything fell apart. Because on June 6, 1944, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, and James Sullivan was part of the first wave that hit Omaha Beach. Private Tommy O'Brien, the 19-year-old from Boston who dreamed of bakeries, was shot before he even made it out of the landing craft. He died in the water, his blood mixing with the salt spray and the screams of dying men. James carried his picture of Annie the redhead in his pocket alongside Margaret's jade bracelet, and he thought of them both as he ran across the sand, as bullets tore through the air like angry hornets. As men fell around him like autumn leaves, he made it to the seawall. Against all odds, through some miracle or curse, he made it across that hellish beach and pressed himself against the concrete, gasping for breath, his ears ringing, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his rifle. He was alive. Somehow, impossibly, he was alive, but the day wasn't over. The fighting went on for hours, brutal and relentless. James and the survivors of his unit pushed forward, taking German positions inch by bloody inch. He saw things that day that would have destroyed him if he had lived. Friends torn apart, boys crying for mothers who couldn't hear them, the machinery of war grinding human beings into nothing. As the sun began to set on D-Day, as the beach finally fell silent except for the moans of the wounded and dying, James Sullivan reached into his pocket and pulled out Margaret's jade bracelet. His hands were covered in mud and blood. He didn't know if it was his own or someone else's. The bracelet was intact, cool and smooth against his palm, a small piece of peace in the middle of hell. He thought about the cherry blossoms in Golden Gate Park. He thought about Margaret's smile and the way she laughed and the promises they had made. He thought about the future they had planned. The house by the ocean, the children, the life of stories and healing and love. It felt impossibly far away, like something from another universe, another lifetime. "I'm going to come home to you," he whispered to the bracelet, to Margaret, to whatever God was listening. "I promise. I'm going to make it through this, and I'm going to come home." But some promises are made to be broken. Some futures are never meant to be lived. And sometimes, love isn't enough to survive the things the world throws at us. The telegram arrived on June 15, 1944. Margaret was working the night shift at San Francisco General Hospital when her supervisor found her in the supply room, counting bandages with mechanical precision, her mind 1,000 miles away in France where she knew, somehow, she just knew, James was fighting for his life. "Margaret," Mrs. Rodriguez said gently, her kind face creased with concern. "You need to go home, dear. Someone came by, left this for you." The envelope was yellow. Western Union. Margaret's hands went numb, and for a moment the world tilted sideways. She had seen these telegrams before, had watched other women receive them, had witnessed the exact moment when hope died in someone's eyes. Now it was her turn. She opened it right there in the supply room, her fingers trembling so badly she nearly tore the paper. The words swam before her eyes. "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that Private First Class James M. Sullivan has been reported missing in action since 6 June in France." Missing, not killed, missing. The word echoed in her mind like a prayer, like a lifeline. Missing meant there was still hope. Missing meant he could still be alive somewhere, wounded perhaps, lost perhaps, but alive. She clung to that word like a drowning person clings to driftwood. Mrs. Rodriguez drove her home that night. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, the telegram clutched in her hands, staring out at the dark streets of San Francisco without really seeing them. When they passed Golden Gate Park, she turned her head away. She couldn't look at the cherry trees. Not now. Not yet. The waiting became unbearable. Every day she checked the mail with shaking hands, desperate for any news. An update from the War Department, a letter from James that had been delayed, anything to confirm he was alive. But the mailbox remained empty, except for bills and newspapers full of stories about the Allied advance through France, about victories bought with blood and sacrifice. She continued working at the hospital, pouring all her grief and fear into caring for others. The wounded kept coming back from the Pacific, young men with missing limbs and shattered minds, and she tended to them with gentle hands and a breaking heart. Each one could have been James. Each one was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's beloved. Each one was a reminder of how fragile life was, how quickly everything could be taken away. At night, she would go home to her small apartment in Chinatown and read James's letters over and over again, memorizing every word, every promise, every dream they had shared. She wore his last letter folded against her heart, the one where he had written, "I'm going to come home to you, Margaret. I swear it on everything I hold sacred." The cherry blossoms bloomed again in the spring of 1945, and still, there was no word. The war in Europe ended in May. Victory celebrations filled the streets, people dancing and crying and thanking God it was finally over. But Margaret couldn't celebrate. She stood under the cherry trees in Golden Gate Park, alone, watching the petals fall like pink snow, and wondered if James had survived long enough to see this peace he had fought for. In August 1945, Japan surrendered and the war was truly over. The boys started coming home. Not all of them, never all of them, but enough to fill the streets with reunions and tears of joy. Margaret watched from her apartment window as families embraced their returning soldiers, as sweethearts kissed in the street, as the world tried to pretend everything could go back to normal. But James didn't come home. The mailbox remained empty, and slowly, horribly, Margaret began to understand what missing in action really meant. It meant limbo. It meant uncertainty. It meant hope stretched so thin it became torture. She continued to write him letters, even though she had nowhere to send them. She would sit at her small kitchen table and fill pages with her thoughts, her fears, her undying love. And then she would fold them carefully and place them in the wooden box with all the others. It became a ritual, a way to keep him alive in her heart, a way to maintain the connection between them even as the silence stretched from weeks to months to a year. "My dearest James," she wrote in the spring of 1946, "it's been 2 years since I last heard from you. 2 years of waiting, of hoping, of praying for a miracle. The cherry blossoms bloomed again today, and I stood under our trees and remembered every promise we made. I'm still keeping mine, my love. I'm still waiting. I don't know if you can hear me, wherever you are, but I need you to know, I haven't given up. I will never give up on us." Then, in September 1946, a letter arrived. Not from James, but from someone who had known him. Tommy O'Brien's mother, writing from Boston, had somehow tracked down Margaret's address. The letter was stained with tears, written in a shaking hand. "Dear Miss Chen, I hope this letter finds you well. My son Tommy wrote to me about James Sullivan and the girl he loved. You. Tommy died on D-Day, but I wanted you to know that he survived long enough to tell James to run, to get off that beach, to make it home to you. I've been trying to find survivors from their unit, trying to piece together what happened to the boys who made it past the beach. I finally heard from a soldier named Robert Hayes. He said James was wounded on D-Day but survived. He said James talked about you constantly, showed everyone your picture, promised he was going to marry you under cherry blossom trees. But then, I'm so sorry to tell you this, my dear. Robert said James volunteered for a dangerous mission in July 1944, near a town called St. Lo. The unit was ambushed. Most of the men were killed. James was among those who never made it back. Robert said he was carrying a jade bracelet and your picture when they lost him. I'm so terribly sorry. I know what it's like to lose someone you love. My Tommy is gone and part of my heart went with him. But I wanted you to know that James loved you until the very end. That has to count for something." Margaret read the letter 3 times before the words truly sank in. James was gone. Not missing. Not lost. Gone. Dead somewhere in a French field, buried in unmarked ground or left to rot where he fell. The hope she had been clinging to for 2 years shattered like glass. And the grief that followed was so overwhelming she couldn't breathe. She collapsed to the floor of her apartment, the letter still clutched in her hands, and screamed. It was a sound of pure anguish, the sound of a heart breaking beyond repair, the sound of a future dying before it ever had a chance to live. Her neighbors heard and came running, but she was beyond comfort, beyond consolation. She had lost him. After all the waiting, all the hoping, all the promises, she had lost him. For weeks, she was a ghost. She went to work, performed her duties, came home, and stared at the walls. She stopped eating properly. She stopped sleeping. She stopped believing in anything except the crushing weight of her grief. The wooden box with the letters sat unopened under her bed. She couldn't bring herself to read his words anymore. They hurt too much. They promised a future that would never come. Winter came to San Francisco, cold and gray, matching the desolation in Margaret's heart. She moved through the world like a woman underwater, everything muffled and distant and unreal. Her co-workers at the hospital worried about her. Her father begged her to eat, to sleep, to live. But living felt impossible when the person you were supposed to live for was gone. On a Tuesday morning in December 1946, a package arrived at her apartment building. It was small, battered, postmarked from somewhere in France. Margaret's hands shook as she signed for it, her heart hammering against her ribs. Hope, that cruel, persistent thing, flickered to life in her chest. She didn't open it right away. She was too afraid of what it might contain. Instead, she placed it on her kitchen table and stared at it for hours, as if she could divine its contents through sheer force of will. Finally, as the winter sun set and shadows filled her apartment, she found the courage to cut through the string and brown paper wrapping. Inside was her mother's jade bracelet. The jade bracelet she had given James for luck, for protection, for love. And beneath it, a letter. Not from James, but from a French woman named Elise Dubois. Dear Miss Chen, the letter began in careful English. I am writing to you because I made a promise to a dying American soldier, and I am a woman who keeps her promises. His name was James Sullivan, and he died in my family's barn in July 1944, 3 days after he was brought to us by a member of the French resistance. He had been shot twice, once in the chest, once in the leg. We did everything we could to save him, but the wounds were too severe, and we had no proper medical supplies. He was conscious for 2 days, and during that time he spoke of you constantly. He told me about the cherry blossoms in San Francisco, about the promises you made, about the life you were supposed to build together. He asked me to find you, to send you this bracelet, and to tell you that his last thoughts were of you. He said to tell you that he tried to keep his promise, that he tried to come home. He said to tell you that loving you was the best thing he ever did. He died on July 12, 1944 at approximately 6 in the evening. He was not alone. I held his hand and told him about the sunset, about how beautiful it was. He smiled and said you would have loved it. Those were his last words. Margaret would have loved this. I buried him in our family cemetery, beneath a cherry tree, the only one in our village. I thought it was fitting. I am enclosing a photograph of the grave and a map of how to find it, should you ever wish to visit. I am so sorry for your loss, mademoiselle. The war took so much from all of us. But know that James Sullivan died with your name on his lips and love in his heart. Some loves transcend death itself. I believe yours is one of them. Margaret didn't cry. The tears had all been spent weeks ago. Instead, she held the bracelet in her hands. The same bracelet her mother had worn in Shanghai. The same bracelet she had given James for protection. The same bracelet that had crossed an ocean and survived a war only to be returned to her as a memorial of everything she had lost. It was cool and smooth against her palm, exactly as she remembered. She looked at the photograph Elise had enclosed, a simple grave with a wooden cross, flowers planted around it, and yes, a small cherry tree standing guard. James Sullivan, 1917-1944. Beloved son, soldier, friend. The French woman had taken care of him, even in death. A stranger had shown him more kindness than his own country, which had left him in an unmarked grave on a foreign beach. That night, Margaret opened the wooden box under her bed, the one that held all of James's letters, all the promises they had made, all the dreams that would never come true. And she found the letter he had written to her on the night before D-Day, the one the army had held back because he had been listed as missing. It had arrived with Elise's package, forwarded by some bureaucratic miracle. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. The paper was creased and stained, as if it had been carried in someone's pocket for months. James's handwriting was shakier than usual, betraying his fear, his uncertainty, his desperate hope. My dearest Margaret, tomorrow we go across the channel. Tomorrow we fight for freedom, for peace, for the right to go home to the people we love. I'm terrified, if I'm being honest. I've seen what war does to men, and I don't know if I'm brave enough to face what's coming. But then I think of you, and I remember why I'm here. I'm fighting so that you can live in a world without fear, so that our children, if we're blessed with them, can grow up in peace, so that love can triumph over hate. I'm carrying your bracelet over my heart. I'm carrying your picture in my pocket. I'm carrying you with me into battle, and that makes me braver than I've ever been. If something happens to me, and I pray it won't, but we both know it might, I need you to know that loving you has been the greatest honor of my life. You taught me what it means to belong to someone, to be seen and understood and accepted completely. You made me believe in the kind of love that poets write about, the kind that lasts beyond death. So if I don't make it back, please don't mourn me forever. Live, Margaret. Live the life we dreamed about. Find happiness. Fall in love again if you can. I want you to be happy, even if I can't be there to see it. But know this, in whatever comes after, in whatever heaven or eternity waits for us, I'll be waiting under the cherry blossoms. I'll be waiting for you. And when your time comes, many years from now after a long and beautiful life, I'll be there to take your hand and keep the promise I made. We will meet again, my love. I believe that with every fiber of my being. This isn't goodbye. It's just, see you later. I love you, Margaret Chen. I will love you for all eternity. Wait for me under the cherry blossoms. I promise I'll find you there. Forever yours, James. The tears came then, hot and fierce and cleansing. Margaret wept for James, for the life they never got to live, for the future that had been stolen from them. She wept for Tommy O'Brien and his bakery dreams, For Elise Dubois, who had held a dying stranger's hand. For all the young men who had marched off to war believing they would come home. She wept until there were no tears left, until she was empty and exhausted, and somehow impossibly ready to begin healing. 23 years passed like water flowing downstream, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, but always moving forward. Margaret Chen became Margaret Tanaka in 1952, marrying a kind Japanese-American doctor named Henry, who had lost his own fiancée to illness during the war. Their marriage was born of companionship rather than passion, of shared grief rather than shared dreams. But it was gentle and good, and sometimes that was enough. They had 2 children, a daughter named Sarah and a son named James. Margaret never told Henry why she chose that name, and he never asked. Some grief was too private to share, even with a spouse. She was a good wife, a devoted mother, a talented nurse who eventually became a nursing supervisor. She built a life that looked complete from the outside. But every spring, without fail, Margaret would visit Golden Gate Park alone. She would stand under the cherry blossom trees near Stowe Lake, the same trees where she and James had made their promises, and she would remember. She would remember his smile and his green eyes and the way his voice sounded when he said her name. She would remember the taste of salt and sorrow on their last kiss. She would remember the promises they made and the future they never got to live. She kept the wooden box under her bed, even after she married Henry. Inside were James's letters, the jade bracelet, Elise Dubois' letter, and the photograph of his grave beneath the cherry tree in France. Sometimes, late at night when Henry was asleep, she would take out the box and read the letters by moonlight, letting herself remember what it felt like to be loved by James Sullivan. In 1967, when Margaret was 48 years old, her daughter Sarah graduated from nursing school. The ceremony was in May, and the cherry blossoms were in full bloom. After the celebration, after the family photographs and the congratulations, Margaret asked Sarah to walk with her through the park. They stood together under the trees, watching the pink petals drift down around them like spring snow. Sarah, who had her mother's dark eyes and gentle hands, looked at her mother's face and saw something she had never seen before. A profound sadness mixed with an equally profound peace. "Mom," Sarah said quietly, "why do we come here every spring? Why do you always stand under these specific trees?" Margaret was silent for a long moment, watching the petals fall. Then, surprising herself, she began to tell her daughter about James Sullivan, about the boy with green eyes and dreams of becoming a writer, about the promises made under these very trees, about a war that took him away and never gave him back, about a love that had shaped her entire life, even though it lasted barely 2 years. "I never told you about him," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "I never told anyone, but you deserve to know that before I was your mother, before I was Henry's wife, I was James's girl, and some part of me will always belong here, under these trees, waiting for a boy who never came home." Sarah held her mother while she cried, understanding for the first time the source of the melancholy that sometimes crossed her mother's face, the reason she always seemed to be looking for something just beyond reach. When Margaret's tears finally subsided, Sarah asked the question that mattered. "Did you love Dad?" "Yes," Margaret said honestly. "I loved your father. I still do. But I loved James Sullivan first, and that kind of love, it doesn't go away. It just becomes part of who you are. I've carried James in my heart for 23 years, and I'll carry him until the day I die. That doesn't diminish what I feel for your father. It just means I have room in my heart for both." That summer, Margaret finally made the trip to France. Henry encouraged it, understanding somehow that his wife needed this pilgrimage, this closure, this chance to say a proper goodbye. She traveled alone, carrying the jade bracelet and the photograph Elise Dubois had sent 21 years earlier. The village of Saint-Lô had been rebuilt after the war, but the cemetery remained, a small plot of land behind what had once been the Dubois family farm. Margaret found the grave easily. The cherry tree had grown tall and strong, its branches spreading protectively over the simple headstone that now read, "Private First Class James Michael Sullivan, United States Army, 1917 to 1944. He died far from home but never forgot love." Margaret knelt beside the grave and placed her hand on the cool stone. She hadn't spoken to James in over 2 decades, had convinced herself it was pointless, that the dead couldn't hear, that prayers went unanswered. But here, in this quiet French cemetery with the cherry blossoms blooming overhead, she found her voice. "Hello, my love," she whispered. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come. I wanted to tell you that I kept my promise. I waited for you under the cherry trees every spring. I waited and I remembered and I never forgot. But I also lived, James. I got married and had children and built a life. just like you told me to in your last letter. I hope you're not disappointed. I hope you understand. I tried to be happy. I tried to honor your memory by living fully, by loving deeply, by being the person you believed I could be. Our daughter graduated from nursing school. I wish you could have met her. I wish you could have met both of our children. Yes, our children. I named my son after you. I hope that's all right. I needed to say your name, to keep you alive somehow. 23 years, James. 23 years since I lost you. And still, on quiet nights, I dream about what our life could have been. Still, every spring my heart aches for you. Is that foolish? Am I foolish for carrying this love for so long? I don't know. I only know that I loved you then, and I love you still, and I will love you until I draw my last breath. Wait for me, James Sullivan. Wait for me under the cherry blossoms, wherever you are. When my time comes, I'll find you. That's my promise. That's my vow. I'll find you, and we'll finally have that life we dreamed about. Until then, rest well, my darling. You are loved. You are remembered. You are cherished. Always. She stayed at the grave until sunset, watching the light paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, remembering James's last words according to Elise. Margaret would have loved this. And she did. She loved the beauty of it, loved the peace of it, loved knowing that he had died thinking of her, that his last thought had been to imagine her beside him, sharing one final sunset. Before she left France, she planted roses around his grave, deep red roses that would bloom every summer. A reminder that love doesn't die just because the beloved does. She left the jade bracelet on his headstone, finally returning the gift she had given him for protection all those years ago. It belonged here, with him, in this quiet cemetery where he had found rest. Margaret Chen Tanaka lived for 36 more years after that trip to France. She watched her children grow and marry and have children of their own. She became a grandmother, then a great-grandmother. She saw men walk on the moon, and the Berlin Wall fall, and the world change in ways she never could have imagined. She aged gracefully, her black hair turning silver, her hands becoming wrinkled and spotted. But her eyes remained bright, always searching for something just beyond reach. Henry died in 1998, and Margaret grieved him sincerely. He had been a good husband, a good father, a good man. But when the mourning period ended, she felt something shift inside her, a sense of anticipation, of nearing completion. She was 80 years old and she was tired, so very tired. In the spring of 2003, Margaret asked her daughter Sarah to take her to Golden Gate Park one last time. She was frail now, moving slowly with a walker, but she insisted on standing under the cherry trees near Stowe Lake. Sarah helped her to a bench and sat beside her, holding her hand while they watched the blossoms fall. "Do you remember when I told you about James?" Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I remember." "Mom," Sarah said, squeezing her mother's hand gently. "I need you to understand something," Margaret continued, her eyes fixed on the falling petals. "I'm ready now. I've lived a good life. I've loved deeply. I've seen my children and grandchildren grow. But I'm ready to keep my promise." "What promise, Mom?" Sarah asked, though part of her already knew. "I promised James I would wait for him under the cherry blossoms. I've been waiting for 61 years, and now I think it's almost time to stop waiting and start finding." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "Don't talk like that. You're going to be fine." Margaret smiled and patted her daughter's hand. "We're all going somewhere, sweetheart. And I'm not afraid. I'm going home. I'm going to the boy with green eyes who promised to meet me again. I'm going to have the life we dreamed about, just in a different place than we expected." She died 3 weeks later in her sleep, peacefully, with a smile on her face. Sarah found her in the morning, looking more at rest than she had in years. On the nightstand was the wooden box, opened for the first time in decades. James's letters were spread around her like fallen petals, and clutched in her hand was the final letter he had written, the one where he promised to wait for her under the cherry blossoms. Sarah buried her mother's ashes under the cherry trees in Golden Gate Park, in a small private ceremony. It wasn't technically allowed, but she did it anyway, scattering her mother's remains beneath the branches where Margaret and James had made their promises so many years ago. She planted a small stone marker that read simply, "Margaret Chen, 1922-2003. She kept her promise. And then Sarah went home and wrote a letter to the cemetery in Saint-Lô, France, asking them to place flowers on James Sullivan's grave. She explained who her mother was, what James had meant to her, how their love had survived war and death and 61 years of separation. She asked them to plant another cherry tree, so that James wouldn't be alone, so that in some small way, Margaret and James could be together again. The cemetery caretaker, a man named Michel Dubois, the grandson of Elise, responded with a photograph. He had planted the tree himself right beside James's grave. The two cherry trees stood together now, their branches intertwining, their blossoms falling together each spring like pink snow. "Your mother and Private Sullivan are together now," he wrote. "Love like theirs doesn't end. It just transforms. The trees will stand as a reminder that some promises are kept, even if it takes a lifetime." And so the story ends. But the love never does. Margaret and James never got their house by the ocean, or their children, or the simple life they dreamed about. But they got something more. A love so pure and true that it transcended time and death and all the broken promises the world could throw at them. Every spring, the cherry blossoms still bloom in Golden Gate Park, and in that small cemetery in Saint-Lô, France, the petals still fall like pink snow. And if you stand very quietly beneath those trees, if you listen with your heart instead of your ears, you might hear the echo of a promise made long ago. "Wait for me under the cherry blossoms. I'll find you. I promise." Some people say love is temporary, that time heals all wounds, that we move on and forget. But Margaret and James prove something different. They prove that true love leaves a mark on the world that can never be erased. They prove that the promises we make matter, even when we can't keep them the way we intended. They prove that waiting is not weakness. It's the strongest kind of faith. Their story reminds us that life is fragile and war is cruel, and sometimes the people we love are taken from us too soon. But it also reminds us that love is the only thing that truly lasts. Love is what we carry forward. Love is what makes us human. Love is what gives meaning to all the suffering and loss and heartbreak. So live fully. Love deeply. Make promises and keep them if you can. And if you can't, know that the effort matters. The trying matters. The love matters most of all. If this story touched your heart, if Margaret and James's love made you believe in something bigger than yourself, share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us about the promises you've kept, the loves you've carried, the people you're still waiting for. And if you want more stories that remind you of what truly matters in this chaotic, beautiful, heartbreaking world, stories that celebrate the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of love, then subscribe to this channel. Because their story doesn't have to end here. Your story is still being written. Make it one worth telling. The cherry blossoms remember. They remember every promise made beneath their branches. They remember Margaret and James. And now, through their story, you'll remember them too. Wait for me under the cherry blossoms. I promise I'll find you there.